All right, y'all. So tonight on State of Play, we are talking about Israeli media manipulation and, the broader context of Trump's cabinet picks. That is the hot topic today. And it's an interesting case study seeing a typically liberal newspaper like the New York Times or Haaretz at one time covering for Israel, but now really concerned about Trump's pro-Israel, no matter what, far-right empowerment cabinet picks with Lee Stefanik, Mike Huckabee, pretty much the entire base, with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard, who has generally campaigned and espoused an anti-war platform. Let's see how it goes under the Trump administration. I just wanted to say before we are joined by senior staff writer Alan MacLeod of Mint Press News to talk about Israeli manipulation of Western media, I just want to say that there was this overriding assumption within the MAGA crowd that Trump is anti-war, anti-interventionalist, but I think the cabinet picks that he has chosen basically disabuse or should disabuse any reasonable person of that notion. So without any further ado, we're going to play a short investigation primer that Alan MacLeod did into Israeli media manipulation real quick, and then we're going to bring him on. So let's go.
The New York Times has just been handed the Pulitzer Prize for its Gaza reporting. This is the same New York Times that publishes headlines like this that completely obscure who is doing the killing or describe hundreds of thousands of people fleeing a genocide as merely on the move. And it's the same paper that changed its headline twice in order to shield Israel from accountability. The first change removes the fact that Israel was the perpetrator of the hospital attack, and the second removes the fact that it was an airstrike at all. At least 500 dead in Gaza hospital blast is a headline for when there's been a gas leak, not a major war crime. It's no coincidence that the Times consistently covers the news in a way that demonizes Palestinians and shields Israel from blame. A leaked company memo from November reveals that management explicitly instructed its reporters not to use words like genocide, ethnic cleansing, or slaughter when referring to events. And in fact, the Times staff are not even allowed to use words like refugee camp, occupied territory, or even Palestine in their reporting. All of this is done to fundamentally erase the reality of what is happening in Gaza and to make it impossible for Times reporters to report accurately on the situation. The Times does use emotive language like slaughter and massacre in its reference to the conflict, but only when Israelis are killed. A study of the paper's coverage showed that Israeli deaths were 22 times as likely to be described as such, despite the overwhelming disparity in deaths towards Palestinians. Thus, Israelis are heinously slaughtered while Palestinians simply die. The New York Times is far from a neutral actor when it comes to Israel-Palestine, of course. Many of their key Middle East reporters have had family members serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, a huge and undisclosed conflict of interest. The Times also purchased a Jerusalem property for its bureau tree that was stolen from a prominent Palestinian family, meaning that it is an active participant in the displacement of Palestinians from their homes. And now their discredited Screams Without Words expose, which claimed that Hamas fighters systematically sexually violated Israelis, was written by a reporter with zero journalistic experience who also happened to be an ex-Israeli Air Force intelligence officer, not to mention her favoriting of genocidal tweets calling on Israel to turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Times staff themselves revolted over the complete lack of evidence and fact-checking in the piece. Considering their dismal journalistic record on Gaza then, the New York Times is arguably the last outlet deserving of a journalism award for its Middle East coverage. The Pulitzers should be ashamed of themselves for giving out this award. They could learn a lot from a group like Project Censored that promotes critical media literacy and critical thinking skills, and who, every year, curates a list of the top 25 most important stories mainstream corporate news sources failed or refused to cover. For more on that, check out projectcensored.org. For Behind the Headlines, I'm Alan MacLeod.
All right, yeah. So I think the Screams Without Silence piece was incredibly egregious. When I saw the October 7th reporting by the New York Times was nominated for a Pulitzer, I was like, oh, it seems like these institutions are somewhat intertwined. But okay, we're gonna dive right into it. So Alan MacLeod, senior staff writer at Mint Press News, thanks so much. Coming to us from the UK, thanks for taking the time.
Great to be with you. How are you doing?
All right. Glad the election is over and we at least know kind of what to expect, I guess, to expect the unexpected and the completely ridiculous. So real quick, I don't know where you wanted to start with this Israeli manipulation of the media. I know you used a New York Times as a case study in your investigation. It's just kind of wild to me that after a year of the same tactics that are very transparent, they've been roundly criticized by the international community, mostly by independent outlets and concerned citizens. How long do you see this going on?
Yeah, listen, I mean, when we look at the New York Times, it's shocking and egregious that they hire people who are direct Israel lobbyists or even Israel intelligence officers like Anat Schwartz, who wrote that ridiculous Screams Without Words expose. But it goes much deeper than the Times. So as my latest report revealed, the Israeli lobbyists working in American media does lay out the Times has hired a whole bunch of people who were former Israel lobbyists to now work in their newsrooms. But they're far from the only ones doing this. Quite frankly, across the board in corporate media, we can see people who used to directly work for the State of Israel and its embassy, or for groups like Stand With Us, Camera, the ADL, or APAC, who have switched careers and gone from being open Israel lobbyists to actually news quite often about Israel itself, which is a massive conflict of interest. We can see this all the way from Fox News on the right, through CNN, CBS, ABC, all the way to MSNBC on the left, whose executive producer, Moshe Arenstein, was actually an Israeli military intelligence commander in his youth. So when we're talking about how far does the rock go, I'm afraid it's absolutely baked into the system. Israel is seen in the United States as a 51st state, and it's a red line for anyone wanting to do any genuinely honest and critical reporting, specifically because it serves as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East for the United States. And that's why it gets special treatment. And that is also why the fact that there are hundreds of people who used to be in the pay of Israel lobbying groups who are now working as journalists and producers and editors in our newsrooms goes unnoticed and unmentioned. However, at least I would say there's been a lot of traction with this new article. A lot of people seem to be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for people with media literacy, I don't think the implementation or the infiltration of major news outlets like the Washington Post or even think tanks like the Atlantic Council is being infiltrated by former intelligence officials or officers or whatever is anything new, but the amount of coordination and their I would say their propaganda apparatus between lobbyists, between people controlling the media, or at least complicit in giving media coverage for Israel within the New York Times, CNN, like essentially name it, BBC. So I was just wondering if you had any sense of like how these different things work together, or was the investigation just basically focused on the relationship between Israeli intelligence, like military intelligence, like 8200, which is their signal intelligence branch that does a lot of their military propaganda, and actual other lobbyist groups within politicians or political circles?
I don't think there's any like grand conspiracy going on here. I don't think there's like an orchestrated campaign to drop Israeli spies and spooks into media outlets. I think it's just more of a conflict, a convergence of interests, whereby if somebody applies for a job as a journalist and they used to be in Israeli intelligence, that's not seen as a gigantic red flag, like it would be if you were a former Hezbollah intelligence officer or an intelligence officer for the governments of Russia or China or whatever. It's inconceivable that those kind of people would be let into America's newsrooms. But because it's the United States' closest ally in the region, suddenly that just becomes normal. Like you were applying for a job and you said you're an ex-Ranger or an ex-Marine or something. People would just see that as normal, a normal career progression. as you said, we should mention that it's not just Israeli lobbyists that are working in media. There's actually a surprising amount of people from Israeli spying organizations, specifically Unit 8200, that are working in media right now, particularly in some of the biggest journalistic outlets that we've got. For instance, in CNN, they've hired a number of people who were former spies for Unit 8200. The one that's on screen right now, I believe that is MacLeod. She spent 3 years as an officer in the Israeli military intelligence group. She was actually a leader in cyber warfare and surveillance. She then served as a technology analyst for Shin Bet, which is another Israeli spying agency. And in 2017, she was hired as a producer for CNN and spent 3 years putting together segments for some of its top shows like Christine Amanpour's show, Fareed Zakaria's show. She now works for Google. But there's quite a lot of CNN people who were previously members of that group. I was able to find at least 3. Tamara Michaelis is another one who previously served as an official spokesperson for the IDF and then went on to work for CNN. So this is the sort of thing that we have to be aware of. This is the sort of thing that's actually going on in our media. There's a real convergence. You know, we talk about a military industrial complex. There's kind of a media complex put on there as well. And over the course of the last few years studying this, I'm starting to see journalism and journalists much more as another arm of empire rather than a protected class of truth tellers. These people are very much doing the work that the empire needs them to do, just like soldiers are.
And, you know, that's why I kind of, on my own platform, have updated the term of the MIC, the military industrial complex, to the MIMAC, the military industrial media and academic complex, because, you know, you can't just go to war, like, especially in a, quote, democracy. You need to manufacture consent. I mean, I know, thinkers like Noam Chomsky have written books on the manufacturing of consent in the media, but they all work together. In hedge fund world and all of these shared combined special interests, interests converge within the, I guess we could give the blanket term elite. So the media manufactures consent for interventionalism and imperialism. The academic world, both institutionally and college campuses, also provides cover. And also part of the academic world is think tanks. You know, they write these policy papers for politicians and legislatures because nobody can be expected to be an expert on every conflict in every region of the world. So they listen to these think tanks, which take government subsidies, and also are paid by lobbyists from Raytheon and Boeing and stuff like and other defense contractors. And it all goes into this major complex. So I definitely do think that I completely agree with you that the media is a militant arm of, the MIMAC and empire as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the classic, like before they send in the troops, they have to send in the journalists. And what I mean by that is that journalists often serve as the front line of any kind of war that the United States or any other empire wants to wage. They first have to soften up the American public by giving them months or even years of propaganda, framing whatever enemy of it is du jour as either a threat to the American people or as somehow subhuman or whatever. And when it comes to the Middle East, I mean, we've seen years and years of treating Muslims as subhuman, as dehumanizing them, treating them as a threat. Every time you see people of a Muslim background on television or in the media, they're always talked about as threats to the United States, not as assets or anything. And you can see this going on for wherever you want to look, whether it's China, where everybody's talking about the buildup of Chinese military and the threat that the Chinese economy poses to the US or whatever, or whether it's Venezuela when we're talking about a terrible dictator taking over the country and, threatening the lives of the poor. We have to step in and do a humanitarian intervention or whatever. It's the same part of the same coin. We're talking about the same thing. And as you said, the world of think tanks plays an important role in that, providing reports, talking about how the United States is falling behind other countries when it comes to the military, and we have to start spending on all of these weapons. And they'll even give suggestions about what we really need to buy. And they'll sometimes be like, we need more of these Raytheon missiles. And then you go to the small print of the website of the Atlantic Council or the CSIS or CNAS or whoever you're reading, and you see they're actually sponsored to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars, by specifically these same companies like Raytheon, like Boeing, like Northrop Grumman, who pour in millions of dollars every year into big media outlets and big think tanks, and then get what they want out of it, which is increased weapons sales. Because all of these academics say we need these things and it'll make us safe. And so for them, it's an absolute no-brainer. Spend a penny to get a dollar back.
Right. And I would just like to put out one more thing. Like, when a lot of people, when they conceptualize the military-industrial complex, it's like, oh, war's happening. Okay, they're going to sell a lot of bombs and stuff. But that's actually not the best return. The best return is massive 10, 20-year long R&D projects like the F-35 project, which hemorrhage money out of the public sector into the private, more so than building bombs. Because, you know, the 2,000-pound bombs are actually kind of cost efficient for what they are, but the R&D contracts to make theoretical deterrents, like how do we create a new weapons system and a new air defense system that's more expensive than the Iron Dome in order to counter future Iranian ballistic missile attacks. So that's already in there. They also have ridiculous things like Northrop Grumman just got a massive contract to conceptually develop moon trains. Okay, because you know we don't need Earth trains here in America. But anyways, I just wanted to bring that up, that a lot of the military industrial complex makes its money from actual like development contracts, more so by, again, stoking fear about, you know, China's military is becoming like near peer. So we need a sixth generation fighter craft. You know, we need more sophisticated air defense systems, stuff like that. So one thing when it comes to the media and how they report on how the Western media reports things. You know, you spend a lot of time, especially I see your posts on X, correcting headlines in order to have like some modicum of journalistic integrity, applying action to, or actor to action, like drone strike kills X people in Jabalia refugee camp. And then you just add Israeli drone strike. So one thing that's kind of striking to me, because I'm sure we both read, you know, Israeli media every day. What's your thoughts on this? So this is Haaretz. It's more of a liberal Israeli news publication. I wouldn't call anything in Israel like left wing, but this is certainly liberal. You know, you see headlines like this: 15 killed in Israeli strikes in Damascus suburbs. So now they're actually applying you know, actor to action. Why do we see this in Israeli media but not in Western media?
You know, it is remarkable that one of the things about this campaign is that the Israeli media are significantly more open to differing ideas and have a little bit of a wider range of acceptable opinion than a lot of American newspapers do and a lot of Western media outlets more generally. So when it comes to Haaretz, you will see headlines talking about how Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza, or talking about how even Israeli hostages, the fathers of the hostages that are still being detained, saying that we are second-class citizens in a fascist country. That was one I saw just yesterday on Haaretz.
Yeah, I read that yesterday.
So yeah, there is still in Israel a bit of wider frame of allowable expression. When it comes to the US, though, I think on a lot of issues, there's really only one opinion that's really allowed. And that's specifically when it comes to matters critical to empire. Being against Israel in the US seems to be about as big a career killer as being against the troops. And that's because ultimately it's pretty much the same thing, right? Because Israel, as I said before, functions as an outpost of the US empire. It provides a very important service to the US, which is helping to control the most strategically important region of the world, the one with the giant, I don't want to say the majority, but the giant revenues in oil and things that the US absolutely wants to be able to control and use for themselves. And Israel provides the US with a very, very important tool in the Middle East in order to do that. Of course, the entire world revolves around oil. If you don't think so, just think about all the plastics in your life, all the transport that you need, agriculture. All of this seems impossible nowadays without oil. And so if we run out, that's a huge, huge disadvantage. And if we are able to control this resource, that gives us enormous leverage over the world in order to dictate it politically. And so ultimately, this has been just a red line in US media for decades now. The criticism of Israel is extremely muted to the point where the US is really off the charts in terms of world opinion when it comes to this issue. You know, when you look at the United Nations and votes that we come in and see, sometimes they're like 183 to 2 or something like that. And it's just the US and Israel voting against condemning the violence or calling for a ceasefire. What I'm saying basically is the problem isn't just in Tel Aviv, it's more so in Washington, D.C. If the Biden administration, or indeed the incoming Trump administration, did want to solve this conflict, they could do it with one phone call.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time. Also, this idea of needing to control, like, the Middle East for oil is nothing new at all. So one thing we did in this, sorry guys, 1 second. So what we did, we during the start of this conflict on my own platform, we got a request, and we got someone to go into the National Archives and pull a memorandum from the beginning of the partition of Israel. This was written by, I think this wasn't Eisenhower. This was Admiral Nimitz and the Joint Chiefs. Okay, so this is a long time strategic thinking, and the positioning of Israel as our aircraft carrier was at first resisted. This is kind of an interesting historical artifact, and it just goes to show that the importance of oil to national security interests from the Cold War it hasn't changed at all. So this was the Joint Chiefs advising against the creation of Israel. And, as to the importance of the stable Middle East, friendly to the United States and Western democracies, it's obvious that this area is the buffer between the USSR and areas of great strategic importance to the United States and potential allies. If the people of the near Middle East turn to the USSR, this would have the same impact on the United States' security and strategic interests in many respects as would military conquest of this area by the USSR. So having comprador governments, like in Jordan and, in Lebanon, and having our stable strategic position in Israel has always been baked into traditional global security thought within the United States. It's never, there has always been this idea that, and if you go into this memorandum, we can link it in the description. You'll see, conversely, denial of these sources to our most probable opponent in the future war, the USSR, would force her to fight an oil-starved war. So at the time, Iranian oil deposits were still controlled by a British company. I'm mind blanking on what it was because this was from 47. Yeah. That's right. Saudi was friendly, and then this aircraft carrier would allow us to power project into the rest of the Middle East and starve out. Well, they didn't necessarily know about Russia's massive oil stores at the time, but it's not just about resource extraction; it's also about resource denial to everybody else. So. That's kind of one of our obsessions with Iran, not just to get the oil, but to deny it from our geopolitical adversaries as well. So, and of course, it's kind of fascinating to just kind of see how, journalism or quote unquote journalism or propaganda is always on the front line of framing these things this way. Iran is at one time this post-revolutionary state on the brink of failure, but at the same time, it's able to have regional power projection and destabilize the entire Middle East and threaten the existence of Israel and by extension, America, because during Harris's campaign, she bizarrely stated that our greatest adversary was actually Iran. So it's all part of this same complex. Do you see the narrative changing anytime soon? Because I was kind of young when the Iraq War broke out, but like the same narrative, it seemed like lasted the entire time throughout. People eventually came to grips with the fact that yes, there was no WMDs, but there was still plenty of public consent for U.S. occupation of that country. So I don't know, how do you see this going in terms of the media's relationship to the narrative that they've stuck to since last October?
Well, narratives often change, but the fundamental interests don't. I don't know if it's the same document, but I remember reading a document from the 1940s from the Roosevelt administration that said that the Gulf energy resources are, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power. And another quote was one of the greatest material prizes in world history. And so there's always some sort of justification for the United States getting involved in these things. Donald Trump, who always says the quiet part out loud, remember when he was talking about Syria, he said he invaded Syria and the US troops are minimal there, but the ones that are there are specifically to get the oil. And then he said something very similar with regards to Venezuela. Wouldn't it be great to invade that country and then we could take all of their resources, meaning oil, and use it for ourselves? And that doesn't mean for ourselves, the American people. That means gigantic American corporations which give money to the Republican and Democratic parties. Venezuela, of course, has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, but the region more generally, the Middle East, is the big place for oil. And that's why we see so much hysteria in parts around Iran, around Yemen, around these countries which could potentially destabilize the US domination. In terms of narrative changing, well, I guess I've been around in the politics game for a while, and I have seen, ever since the Obama administration, what they call the pivot to Asia. There has been something of the United States taking its eye off the ball in the Middle East and looking towards East Asia, specifically to the rise of China as being the threat. Now, we have to be clear about what the threat is. It's not a threat to, Joe and Kelly in Wisconsin. It's the threat to people in Washington being able to do whatever they want at any point all around the world. It's basically the threat that China is going to become big enough and powerful enough to ignore US orders. And that's already what we're seeing. And China, for whatever it's worth, is trying to build something slightly different in the world. It's not being particularly aggressive in terms of, invading countries or whatever, but it is setting up a certain alternative system. I'm thinking specifically about the Belt and Road Initiative, about the BRICS, the economic bloc that seems to be challenging US dominance. These are the things that the United States are truly, truly worried about. I mean, again, by the United States, I mean people in Washington, people in think tanks, people who work in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. They don't really care about ordinary Jims and Joes. It's about maintaining American state power. And since World War II, the United States has had pretty much unquestioned power over much of the world, and certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union. But in the last few years, the rise of China and with Russia now helping the Syrian government and then invading Ukraine, it looks like they've got another adversary there. And so it does look like in the mid-21st century, these are the real gigantic global problems that are going to be the backdrop of all the other political stuff.
Yeah, and I think what's happening in Palestine with Israel and what they're doing is kind of looking at all of that it's kind of like a microcosm for all of what the United States' usual tactics are to fund allied governments, back them to the hilt. You create media cover for it, sanction our enemies, which no longer really works the same way it did. But I just wanted to circle back to the Palestine question. Now that Trump is elected, liberal media apparatus really focused on how much worse Trump would be with regards to his support of Israel, his backing of them to the hilt with their West Bank annexation and the turning Gaza into a parking lot. And I was wondering, like, if you thought that there would be any like noticeable difference about what happens on the ground. Trump has campaigned on not being a war hawk, being anti-war and anti-interventionalist, kind of appealing to the isolationist bent within the American right. I was just wondering if you think there'll be any substantive differences on how the so-called war is being conducted.
Well, let's first talk about Trump, because it's true that he didn't start any wars exactly when he was in power
True.
a few years ago. However, it's not like he was some sort of lovely boy handing out roses all around the world. I mean, just off the top of my head, he gave tens of billions of dollars of weaponry and supported the Saudi genocide in Yemen. He dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs, on Afghanistan, which was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever dropped in anger. He attempted to invade Venezuela and had to be talked out of it by the people in the room. He said it would be very cool to own Venezuela because it's really a part of the United States. He pulled out of all the anti-nuclear treaties. He supplied Ukraine with weapons, which is something Obama didn't even want to do. He threatened North Korea with fire and fury. He threatened a cultural genocide against Iran. So this is not somebody who is somebody who's reflexively anti-war down to his core. He actually greatly expanded the military budget. And ultimately, though, I don't really see the changing of presidents or administrations as being something that drastically alters the outlook and the interests of the US government more generally, on a world level anyway. Whether there's a guy with a blue tie or a red tie in the Oval Office, the United States generally acts in more or less the same way. Certainly the Republicans are more interested in certain issues, the Democrats with others. I think Democrats more concerned with Russia, Republicans more concerned with China. And a lot of people have been saying that, it's going to get even worse for people in Palestine, people in Gaza. But I have to scratch my head because, as you said, Gaza has been turned into a parking lot under a Democratic administration. So unless Trump has got something really crazy up his sleeve, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to understand or think about what could get even worse, except for some sort of Israeli invasion of Palestine or the West Bank, or a more general, a bigger one of Lebanon or Iran. But ultimately, these sorts of atrocities have been going on for decades, whether it's Republican or Democrat in office. I mentioned Yemen before. That was happening under both Obama, Trump, and Biden. This genocide that went on and slaughtered perhaps 400,000 Yemenis. We can go back to the 80s when the United States was supplying Saddam Hussein with weapons to use against Iran and indeed against his own people, carrying out a genocide. And even the media back then started raising some issues with that. And the Reagan administration sent a message to Saddam saying, don't worry about our ignorant and invasive media. We've still got your back. The Carter administration strongly supported an Indonesian genocide against the people of East Timor, where when the killing got to the absolute highest level, the Indonesian military ran out of bullets, so Carter sent an emergency shipment of aid over to Indonesia so they can continue. And then we can talk about what happened in Vietnam, of course, the slaughter there. So whether it's a Democrat or Republican administration, generally things tend to be pretty bad for people in the global South. Whether that's actually going to worsen under a Trump administration, he's certainly putting a lot of utterly ghoulish neoconservatives and rabidly strong supporters of Israel into his cabinet. However, I do have to wonder whether that's more, their differences with the Democrats is more a question of style and tone rather than fundamental outlook.
Yes. Yeah. Democrats have better political etiquette. But let's just look at one of the rabid neocons that you brought up. There's a lot of people to choose from. There's Mike Huckabee, there's Marco Rubio, but Elise Stefanik is a great example. I think she was this is the pick. This is the pick for UN ambassador on Trump's cabinet.
As I serve the American people, I will defend George Washington's vision of religious pluralism and freedom. Today, this means
cool religious pluralism, freedom. You think she's going to go one way, but then you remember she's a pretty hardcore
crushing anti-Semitism at home and supplying the state of Israel with what it needs, when it needs it, without conditions to achieve total victory in the face of evil. Chants of death to America are not hollow slogans. They are a promise that what happened here on October 7th could happen in the United States.
Yeah, okay. This has been the whole justification for a forever war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We need to keep it over there or it's coming back to us. So none of these narratives have changed since the global war.
Unless Hamas and its jihadist accomplices are eliminated. And it is the United States' high honor and high responsibility to support Israel's effort. I have been clear at home, and I will be clear here. There is no excuse for an American president to block aid to Israel, aid that was duly passed by the Congress. For years, I have been a leading proponent and partner to President Trump in his historic support for Israeli independence and security, including moving the U.S. Embassy to its rightful place in Jerusalem. Israel is indeed a miracle, an outpost of freedom, of Western values, of civilization, a striking example of human potential, the physical embodiment of Herzl's maxim, if you will it, it is no dream. It's the same founding ethos that we prize in America, the American dream.
The same founding ethos that we pride in America, mass displacement and genocide. A lot to unpack there, but I fail to see how in any substantive way that will shift policy from what the Biden.
If you look at Elise Stefanik's career, it seems that she basically made her career as being staunchly pro-Israel, even in a context of being in Washington, D.C., where pretty much everyone is a supporter of the Israeli project, right? And you can find all sorts of clips of her saying horrid things about Palestinian people or supporting the genocide. But ultimately, again, we come back to it. Somebody like Antony Blinken, who is a Democrat, if you don't know, he will say things like, we're standing up for human rights all around the world, and we want to see a just international order play out, while he's shipping loads of weapons to Israel and quietly saying, do whatever you want. Whereas Republicans like Stefanik will ship the weapons and then say, do whatever you want. But she'll say it out and she'll say things like, Hamas are savages, we have to destroy them completely. Again, though, when we actually look at what happens, there's not really that great a difference in what's going on. Certainly this will embolden a lot of racists inside the United States to perhaps take out their anger on the Arab population, thinking that the presidency and the White House themselves actually have their back, which is quite possibly true. The only good part of this is that Stefanik has been put in charge, has been given the job as the US ambassador to the UN, which ultimately doesn't really, in terms of the cabinet picks, have very much power at all. She's basically going there to vote whichever way the White House tells her to and make some speeches. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the US ambassadorship. I suspect that she, as such a staunch supporter of Israel, she was mentioned in meetings by Israeli lobbyists, people like Miriam Edelson, who gave Trump gigantic amounts of money. And of course, Trump suggested was, some sort of kingmaker in the Republican Party years ago and said he'd never bow to her. But now, let's see what he's doing now. So yeah, I suspect that she's been put in there as a way to placate the Israel lobby or give them something. What sort of power she has is I don't know, pretty marginal, but certainly her rhetoric is absolutely awful.
Yeah. So, and this is a major concern. So we began this segment by talking about the New York Times. We can kind of end there. The New York Times, despite, infiltration by or appointment by former Israeli intelligence officers, and they definitely have a bias towards Israel that is beyond the pale of what you might want to consider ethical journalism. They are concerned about a Trump presidency and what it means for Israel and the United States going forward. Ever since Trump announced his picks, there's been a rash of op-eds. And again, New York Times may be Zionist, but it's still like liberal Zionists. So they've been talking about how is the Israeli right pushing to annex West Bank, sees allies in Trump's picks. The New York Times itself is often critical of the far right in Israel, trying to basically promote a more pluralistic, egalitarian image of Israel. And I think one of the major damaging things about this is how an unleashed and unfettered Israel combined with Trump's administration, which the entire world, most of the world is going to be critical of and sour against, how that relationship will further darken people's perceptions of Israel going forward. And, you're going to, I think, and you may disagree, that New York Times is going to try to do this massive information campaign now to say that, oh, no. See what all these crazy right-wing people are doing and what the crazy Trump administration is supporting them in doing? That's not really Israel. And I think their messaging might change a little bit going forward.
Yeah, exactly. They've been trying to play this off for a long time. Like everything that's wrong with Israel right now is solely the fault of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's this far-right freak who doesn't have huge support. But in reality, Netanyahu is the state of Israel. He has been head of state for longer than any other person in Israel's history. He's not even far-right in an Israeli context. There are lots of people in his cabinet that come from movements which are much more virulently anti-Arab or racist than him. I'm thinking about people like Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, people like that. So yeah, they've been trying to sort of liberal wash Israel for a long, long time. Certain ways they've done that are pinkwashing, making Israel look like a haven for LGBT people, which isn't true. Gay marriage is not legal in Israel. Neither is interracial marriage or a marriage between religions. They tried to talk about how Israel's this great place for vegans. Highly questionable as well. Israel is actually the largest consumer per capita of poultry in the world. So yeah, there's always this attempt by liberal institutions to try to save the idea of Israel from the fundamental reality of what's going on. And it's not entirely different to how a lot of liberals react when the United States elects Trump. It's like, this isn't who we are. Well, I'm afraid it's exactly who we are. And when it comes to the New York Times, I think we'd be remiss to actually, if we didn't even talk about like some of the lobbyists that work at the New York Times, quite apart from the rapidly pro-Israel types like Bret Stephens and Michelle Goldberg, people like that, or the sorts of New York Times columnists who actually have family members serving in the IDF. They have, over the last few years, actually hired a bunch of former Israel lobbyists to work there. So like Dalit Shalom, for example, who's a director there, I think he works on product design. He was a former guide for Birthright Trips, which is the Israeli government program to bring teenage Jews all around the world, hopefully, to settle there. He also worked for the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is an offshoot of the World Zionist Organization. The correspondent for the Times in Jerusalem, Adam Rascon, he interned at the Shalem Center, which was, again, another pro-Israel think tank. He went to work for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is, again, one of these hawkish think tanks with very close links to the state of Israel. Sofia Poznansky, she's a New York Times newsroom assistant. She worked, again, at what is essentially another birthright organization. Works closely with other Israel lobby groups like the ADL and Stand With Us. Editorial assistant Rania Raskin, she worked for the Tivka Fund, which is supposed to be promoting, it's an organization that promotes Zionism into young Jewish American communities. So there are just a myriad of people in the Times. This is the sort of mentality they have. They still have that sort of liberal Zionist outlook. But as far as what's been going on in the past 12 months in Israel, and frankly, for a lot longer than that, that liberal Zionist outlook and that image of Israel has been crumbling. And it's also crumbling around the world when Israel carries out this kind of massive violence. We've seen huge boycotts of Israeli products and American products as well in support of the people in Gaza who are living through a genocide. I saw a poll recently that showed that Israel's standing in the world had dropped in 42 out of the 43 countries that was measured, and that was only a couple of months after that. And frankly, the United States is going the same way. Their position in the world is dropping. And it's not just because of Israel, it's also because of the sanctions that they've placed across the world, the endless wars that are going on, and the juxtaposition between their leaders saying that they stand for democracy, freedom, and human rights, when they are denying that to so many people in the world. It just can't survive endlessly.
Yeah, and I think the loss of soft power, especially for Israel and by extension the United States, through sanctions, a disputed casus belli for the war in Ukraine, and the support of the ongoing genocide in Palestine have contributed to our lessening ability to co-opt rather than to coerce. And one of the main concerns for the Israelis and their interests is this idea of pariah statehood, that they'll go the way of South Africa or the Rwandan government or like certain Balkan states earlier on because they're live streaming a genocide, and that really doesn't help with the image. There's this push to normalize Saudi Arabia and Israeli relations. MBS has Mohammed bin Salman, for y'all who don't know, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and essentially the head of government, has basically said Israel's committing a genocide. And he's explicitly said it, and now he can't normalize until it stops. That's just how it works. So I do think if we're talking about Israeli manipulation of the media going forward, I think it's going to be an attempt to try and find a way, narratively and rhetorically speaking, to kind of safeguard Israel's reputation now going forward, since so many people are accepting this as a genocide, to kind of, scapegoat a certain number of individuals as if the entire society, military apparatus, and political apparatus doesn't actually support what's going on, which internal polling says they do.
There was a poll that I saw. It was a while back, but it said that it was only about 2% of Israelis thought the response to October 7th was disproportionately violent from the Israeli side. So they were saying only about 2% of Israelis thought they were using too much violence against Gaza. But in terms of Israel's reputation, it's absolutely cratered throughout most of the world. And it seems the Israelis know that, and they're trying to shore up support in the countries that they think that matter. I looked at this last year, but the Israeli government spent gigantic amounts of money, tens of millions of dollars, on ads promoting Israel and sort of just presenting Hamas as this unique threat, an ISIS-like threat. And the countries that they were spending that money on, it wasn't equidistant or equal throughout the entire world. Where they were spending it was North America and Western Europe. They were basically the only places that they were targeting these ads. So if you lived in Belgium or France or the US, you probably saw tons of ads actually paid for by the Israeli Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Communications, targeted specifically at you, trying to get you to empathize with the Israeli position. And that's ultimately where I think they're at. They know that they've lost the world. They can see that in all the United Nations votes that come in all the time, or in the public opinion polls that show that Israelis are not popular in Asia or Africa or Latin America. all around the world, if you travel, you'll see murals everywhere featuring Palestinian flags or Palestinian resistance fighters or whatever. You won't see that in Western Europe and the United States very often, unless you go to somewhere like the Republic of Ireland or Belfast. So that means that Israel is increasingly a pariah state and is just trying to keep as many Western European nations and North American nations close to it as possible, and just try and fight this sort of rearguard action and hope that better days come. And the United States, as we said, are trying to help them with that by trying to scapegoat a few leaders in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to place the blame on them and not look at the fundamental reason to be the raison d'etre of Israel, which is the Zionist project in the first place, which means trying to create a state on top of one that already existed by kicking out millions of people.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point. They're kind of, it's kind of like a sinking ship, and they're trying to bail out water from certain locations, focusing on countries they think that matter and countries that don't. And honestly, I think that, you know, this rhetorical rearguard action to protect their image is going to fare even worse than it has under the Biden administration as the Trump administration, because again, they don't have the same political etiquette as Democrats do, even though they support the same policies. And I think that will ultimately, a Trump administration that completely lets Israel off the leash and empowers their far right to say what they've already been saying in a more open fashion, and have our own politicians say the same things that their far right crazy Zionist politicians are saying. It's actually going to be worse when it comes to painting Israel as the aggressor and the pariah statehood. And in terms of policy, I don't really see how it changes anything from this Haaretz article from today. While Israel seeks deal in Lebanon, and they're seeking deal in Lebanon because they can't defeat Hezbollah, and they're not going to be. It doesn't matter how much support politically or in terms of munitions the Trump administration gives them, because the IDF will need to be increasingly economical with munitions and winter conditions. There's not only a munitions shortage within Israel, despite how many bombs we've given them. We've diverted munitions from Ukraine. We're going into our own stockpiles. They've dropped so many bombs that there is a shortage in America to keep supplying Israel unconditionally, no matter what. There's actually a massive RDX shortage, which is the explosive compound, global supply chain shortage of RDX, which is what goes into munitions. So, I just wanted to point that out as one of the reasons why it doesn't change policy, unless they put U.S. boots on the ground, which would cause a massive backlash. And I don't think Trump would ever do that, knock on wood. But I think that a Trump administration is actually going to be worse for Israel, personally.
That's a very interesting take, and it's one of the only takes I've seen coming from the likes of the New York Times, which I think I might have to agree with. But when the Trump administration came in last time, it coincided with a giant drop in American prestige around the world. People simply just don't buy it when people like Mike Pompeo got up on stage and talk about how the United States stands for democracy. It seemed that a lot of people did buy it when it was some person from the Obama administration. But if this continues, wars can't be fought indefinitely without any kind of resolution. And we're seeing that in Ukraine, with more and more people are saying we need to come to the table and get a deal with Vladimir Putin. And that's not going to be good for the Ukrainian government at all. President Zelensky is on a quite shaky ground there. I just wonder, when looking at this, looking at Ukraine, looking at Israel, whether the people of Taiwan are going to be affected, and thinking, do we really want to keep pushing for sort of US-backed independence? Do we want to look like Ukraine, or do we want to be the Ukraine of Asia? I'm not sure. When Trump emboldens Israel to do absolutely whatever it wants, not that Biden was, keeping them on the leash particularly, but if Trump is doing that, that might hasten Israel's downfall. I know their economy is in a terrible shape. As you said, they rely on Western countries, primarily the United States, for the weaponry and for the political support. So if that stops coming, yeah, the war could be over at any time. And that's one thing everybody watching this has to remember, that, you know, people in the United States actually have a unique ability to truly affect what happens in the rest of the world by pressuring their own governments into more positive action.
Yeah, it's going to definitely be harder to do that under Trump. But then again, who knows? Like, everything we didn't even move the needle with the Biden administration. But hopefully now that Trump is president, there'll be more intersectionality between activism movements, not just the pro-Palestine stuff, but also environmentalist movements, Stop Cop City, all these other things that can probably come together. Because it's certainly, we have reason to suspect that, again, because they're not as polite and they don't try to hide their violence as much as the Democrats do, things will probably get more and more gnarly on the street. So I guess going forward, the major takeaway is, yes, they influence our media. Now that the Trump administration is in power, we're going to start to see rhetoric shift from more like apologism, I think, for the far right in Israel, and within the context of criticizing the Trump administration through the lens of, you know, a liberal publication like the New York Times. And eventually, I think, because the main concern is pariah statehood in going the way of South Africa, I think there's going to be a lot of apologism for that as well. Not just obscuring the facts, but trying to be like, Israel's actually redeemable, XYZ. So,
It's been great talking to
I just
you.
wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Appreciate it as always.